Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We begin today with an acknowledgement that we are gathered on Boonwurrung country. I pay my respects to the Boonwurrung people as the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. As part of their deep connection to country, the ancestors of the Boonwurrung people have cared for this land for thousands of years. And as the first people of this country, they are also the first gardeners. We are all greatly in their debt for their care for the land, waters and sky since time immemorial. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Anna Foley. Can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you from the back row. I'm a member of the Heritage Council of Victoria, the sponsor of today's talk. The Heritage Council of Victoria is an independent authority that makes decisions about protecting objects of cultural heritage significance in Victoria. We independently review and decide what gets included in the Victorian Heritage Register. We give advice on the protection of Victoria's cultural estate, and we promote and celebrate Victoria's heritage. And it's in that spirit of celebration that we ask you to join us here today. We'll be digging into Victoria's heritage gardens today, and I think you'll agree with me when I say that Victoria is really quite unique in its garden heritage, not just in Australia but globally. And I'm sure many of you remember a time when every car on the road proudly promoted the Garden State. And those heritage gardens aren't just a thing of the past, they're living, evolving landscapes with a really important role to play in today's warming and changing world. So heritage gardens are really beautiful, yes, as we have evidence outside the windows from where we sit right now, but they're also repositories of memory, centres of technical knowledge, and tools for climate resilience. And today you'll hear from a panel of experts who have worked directly in some of the most significant heritage landscapes in Victoria. So after about 50 minutes of discussion, we'll open the floor and take a few questions, so keep them in mind as we go. And today I want to introduce you, if you don't already know them, to four brilliant plant people. With me is Andrea Proctor, a landscape architect and horticulturalist with over 20 years' experience. Her practice specialises in community spaces, botanic gardens and heritage landscapes, bringing care and creativity to Australia's living landscapes. Claire Hart is the Director of Horticulture at Melbourne Gardens at the Royal Botanic Gardens of Victoria. With nearly 30 years in horticulture and arboriculture, Claire leads work on landscape succession, climate adaptation and public green space management. Alice Crowe is a gardener, botanist and lawyer and co-founder of Growing Farmers. She is the former kitchen gardener at Heidi Museum of Modern Art and author of A Heidi Harvest, a book that celebrates the rich heritage of Heidi's iconic kitchen garden. And Justin Buckley manages the National Trust's garden and environmental heritage sites across Victoria, caring for some of the state's most significant landscapes with a focus on long-term stewardship and engaging people in those places. So let's begin. The title of today's event invites us to explore the rich history of heritage gardens, but these gardens aren't just about the past. What does heritage mean in the context of a living landscape, and why do these gardens matter in a warming and changing world? Andrea?
This one's for me. And no, that isn't my phone ringing. Thanks, everyone. I guess with heritage, there's this sort of perception that heritage means old, when that's actually not the case. Heritage means special. And heritage, if you actually go looking for it, it's really hard to find a definition. The dictionary doesn't help, the internet doesn't help. But organisations like the Heritage Council through Heritage Victoria have criteria that these spaces meet. And it can be about old, it can be about history, it can be about that course and pattern of Australia's and Victoria's history. So you've got something like the garden state there. But equally, it can be about the social connection people have to spaces, which we see so often, where people have been brought by their grandparents and come through their lives and bring their children and bring overseas visitors to visit these spaces. It's the aesthetic value, it's the beauty, and that's quite technically prescribed. It can be everything from the beautiful vistas across the lake at the Ballarat at Melbourne, or the long straight vistas of Carlton Gardens. It can be about creative and technical achievement, so something like Ripponlea here and that incredible water story. And with a lot of this, change is actually part of the significance. These are gardens that have grown and moved and continue to be used as scientific resources. And they're not all old. Heidi's from the 1960s. Melbourne's 1846, Federation Square's on the Heritage Register at 2005. So these spaces have something about them that people value.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that community, what they mean to people, the stories that they hold is really why they matter. I mean, I think in times past, or if you have a sort of a bit more of an academic view of heritage and this more sort of objective view of why something's important or why it's special, I think the longer you work with these places and the more time you spend in them, the more you understand it really is about the people. Because if it doesn't matter to people, if it doesn't have relevance to people, then there's really, who's it significant to, or why is it significant? So places like this, and as Andrea said, that I suppose if anyone who was here at the earlier talk that was talking about building fabric and preservation and I guess managing things so that they don't change is how the built environment of heritage is often viewed, but in gardens it's the opposite. They're in constant daily change, and you're really just managing that change rather than trying to stop it from happening.
Can I jump in? Yeah, just thinking about, I mean, there's physical heritage, and the fact that there's trees that might be hundreds of years old that people can't generally have in their own private gardens. They may if they're really lucky. But a lot of it, to me, is about that cultural connection and cultural heritage and the deep history that goes with a lot of these gardens, and the love that the community has for them.
Thanks. So you both touched on a couple of points there where the gardens and heritage gardens don't just maintain themselves, as I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have got personal experience in as well. Can some of you share something about the behind the scenes work that goes into maintaining or evolving these spaces? Claire?
I can jump in there if you like. So I'd always start off by saying we're always gardening for tomorrow. So the work of horticulture never stops. And in a heritage garden or a garden like the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne, I'll let you know a bit about the team, I guess. So we have about 26 horticulturists, but that includes a nursery. We also have a landscape architect. We have a senior curator who helps us to define and develop our collections. And I guess the difference between, say, a park and a botanic garden is that we actively manage collections, and we manage them for conservation, for education, for science, and obviously also for enjoyment. So a big part of what the horticulturists do, and we really rely on developing their skills and their experience and their expertise, is they curate collections. So we've got about 23 collections, and each curator has a collections management plan. And in that, they're looking at not just how we're developing it for tomorrow, but the heritage of that collection as well. So how we want to develop it to enhance the collection, what we need to include to broaden the diversity, which is a big part of what a botanic garden does, and heritage gardens in general. They have a lot of plant diversity and a lot of biodiversity. And to do that, they look at connecting with other botanic gardens. That's one way that we get plant material. But another really interesting, people would potentially know, but they go on collecting trips. So we can do that throughout Australia. It's a lot more difficult to do to bring in plant material from overseas, and for good reason. Decades ago, you could go on discovery or collecting trips, and often that was taking material, but taking material that had kind of strong cultural connections and wasn't necessarily, it was kind of in good faith, but taken as opposed to looking at the protocols and looking at how we could potentially preserve those plants in the landscape that they were existing in. So now we have a whole lot of protocols, processes, quarantine for getting plants into Australia, and that obviously is for the purpose of biosecurity. So as a horticulturist in a botanic garden, you need to take all that into consideration when developing your plant collection. So it's a little bit about behind the scenes, and Melbourne Gardens is 38 hectares. It's been there for 175 odd plus years. But again, it is country, so it's been there for a lot longer than that. So our development is constant, it's ongoing, it's ever-changing, and the focus that we have now is for, we have a lot of wild collected material, which is really important to understand some of the genetic background of a lot of plants. But one of our biggest focus is also climate-suited material, but I'll talk about that a little bit later.
And all of that is part of the heritage value of the place, and what the heritage registration says is important and essential to your work.
Absolutely, and I probably, just on that heritage note as well, the important thing is that we have a master plan that guides the way that we design the garden and how we change it. So from a heritage perspective, we don't just say, okay, or acknowledging that, you know, we need to increase plant diversity. It's not like, oh, we have wonderful sweeping lawns, let's just make that into an arboretum. That's not the way that we address heritage. We address heritage by acknowledging and honouring the landscape that it is and the design that it is. It very much still is in the design of William Guilfoyle, and adapting any garden beds or any opportunities that come up for us to plant, and I guess utilising the skill set that we have, particularly with landscape architecture. We're lucky to have a good landscape architect to redevelop those, but in very much in sympathy with the heritage landscape.
Yeah, and even a garden like Ripon Lea, which was a private garden from day one. It's never been a public botanic garden. Doesn't have that institutional scientific basis for it. The diversity of the collection is also really essential or fundamental to the values of the site. So people might not realise, but in the 19th century, there was way more plant diversity available to your average gardener than there is now. You look at nursery catalogues from the 19th century and wish you could get half the things that are on those. And so one of the things that declines over time in gardens like this is that plant diversity, as things that are just hardier, tough it out, get divided, get planted somewhere else. And so actually returning a good diversity into gardens like this is one of the main challenges. And even though we've got a much smaller team of 4 people here, one of the key things for them is they really need to be keen propagators, because a lot of the stuff we just can't get. So they wherever they can get it and grow it and reproduce it, then that's part of the job as well.
Propagating can be really the fun part, because it's it's an experimental process, you know, like you're kind of taking some genetic material, some plant material, and then kind of creating something out of nothing and seeing what comes of it. And then when you plant it out, how does it perform? How does it integrate? You know, like it's a really fun part of the process for me.
Have you got the right spot for it, or
Yeah,
was that a big mistake? Yep.
Yeah. I might jump in and talk a little bit about the Heidi Gardens. Many people here will probably know Heidi. It's a bit of a Melbourne institution, Heidi Museum of Modern Art, which is on the river, the Yarra River, the Birrarung in Bulleen. It also originated as a private garden rather than a public garden, and its founders were John and Sunday Reid, who were very well known in the cultural and philanthropic scene of the time. They're very well known as supporters of the arts, but they were also just dedicated gardeners. Like that was almost in a way the foundation of all of their life and all of the things that they did in the world. And you know, the legacy of the gardens at Heidi today, that's what we, as all Victorians, can benefit from their beautiful vision. It's now managed, when John and Sunday, they lived on the property until their death in the 1980s. They moved into the gardens and that property in the 1930s, and at the time it was an old disused dairy farm. It was basically bare, you know, kind of denuded paddocks. There was very little Indigenous vegetation left, and from that they created a garden that had a working kitchen garden that fed them and the artists who lived there with them. and then, you know, acres and acres of, well, they started planting exotics in terms of trees, and then over the years they kind of, through the practice of seeing what worked and what didn't work and what survived the floods and what survived the droughts and what could manage in their particular conditions, they inevitably, in about the 1960s, developed a much more Australian sensibility in what they were planting. And and then in the 1980s, when they both passed away, they had the vision that the property would be handed over to the state of Victoria, which is what happened, and so that it exists today as an art gallery with the 16 acres of gardens surrounding it. And the kitchen gardens there, which is what the place that I worked in, were... They were working kitchen gardens while the Reeds were living there, and for most of the time since then, and since the property's come into the hands of the state, it has been, working productive kitchen gardens, and the produce that's grown in the kitchen garden is used at the restaurant on site, and that's been the arrangement for a long time. I've already spoken for a little bit, but I just want to talk about volunteers and the role of volunteers in that process. There's always a... every gardener, whether it's a home gardener or you're working in a heritage garden, you've got to manage your resources and the human resources, the capital that you've got is, you've got to spend that wisely. And often, so we had 2.5 gardeners to manage 16 acres of public grounds, which is, you can imagine there's a lot of, we were having a conversation beforehand, quite brutal decision making that has to be made in the management of those gardens. But we had an absolutely extraordinarily wonderful, dedicated, knowledgeable team of volunteers, about 30 volunteers who would come in every Thursday to the kitchen gardens and work with me on, changing over crops, like propagating, collecting seed, and it was, as Justin was saying at the start, it's as much about the people and the connection as it is about, the plants and the physicality of the garden.
Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, just on the context of volunteers as well. So we do have a lot of volunteers at the Botanic Gardens, and it's mostly our friends who are fantastic guides. They also have growing friends, so they have a small nursery that they propagate from our gardens. So again, people often ask, well, how do we potentially get some plants from the gardens? It's go to the friend sales. They have sales twice a year. But one thing I want to just touch on, it's really important that we continue to build skill, expertise and knowledge for horticulturists. It is an area that has a skill shortage. So whilst it's super important that we have our qualified and professional staff on site, but it's also important that we support the greater industry. So we have interns and we offer internships 3 times a year where someone who's just finished their horticultural studies or is still studying, so it's either within that year, can spend up to 8 weeks with our team. So they're immersed within the team, and that's to give them that practical experience, which we're finding that people who have just recently studied obviously need to build that up and are looking for spaces to and places to be able to improve their practical horticultural hands-on skill set. We also have apprentices, and that's one of the key things. We need to keep building in our industry. And I wish I could have up to 6 apprentices. We've got an arboricultural apprentice and also a horticultural apprentice. And it's an extremely important point that we continue to build and provide horticulturists for the next generation.
Yeah, skills is one of our main topics of conversation when we get together, and I'd say definitely one of the key responsibilities we all feel as custodians of these wonderful gardens. It's not just looking after the gardens themselves, it's actually passing on the knowledge and the skills to the next generation of people who are going to be able to do that. And because you can tend to take that for granted or think that it will happen, or you'll just, employ someone when someone leaves. But it's really almost at a crisis point in the industry. And so, as an industry, we feel really strongly that we've got to find new ways and to be as effective as we can in passing on the skills for the people who are going to look after them into the future.
Because these spaces are constantly changing and constantly being nurtured and have for their entire lives. So that skill set and that sort of continuation and that succession planning of staff is absolutely critical to how these spaces are managed.
Yeah, and there's no one better to ask about what does that plant need or how would that plant go in a spot like this than the person who's out there 5 days a week managing them out in gardens like these.
Last time one of the times I was at the RBG Melbourne lately, I was eavesdropping on a couple of the staff talking to each other, and one of them was new, and oh, where have you come from? Oh, I was working at Ripponlea before I came here. So it's a really, I think, important role that the professional pathways that arise through people's personal relationships often, and the connections that there are between gardens in Victoria that maybe, Andrea, you might talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm really interested in these heritage gardens in action. Each of you is working in a space that tells a story, and when you start thinking about the stories that your gardens tell, what comes to the fore for you? Alice, you might want to talk a little bit about Heidi and the sort of the seasonality of Heidi, and what do you think about, what stories come forward for you when you think about that?
Well, when I think about the Heidi Gardens, I really think of Sunday Reid, who was the visionary, really, the person who created the gardens. It was her vision and her, back-breaking labour out there, pulling the slugs off the lettuces, hoeing the rows, and as well as that, the creative vision. Actually, one of the really interesting things that I found while I was researching the book was the Heidi Library is still intact. You can still go there today. The old farmhouse that the Reids lived in is still there, and the front room is the library, and it was like a hotbed of political conversation. But there's also one wall where all of Sunday's gardening books are sitting, as they were at the time that John and Sunday lived there. And so I had the extraordinary privilege of being able to take off the perspex and look through all of her influences so I could read what she was reading. You can't do that these days. You don't know what people have gone to the internet, right? But back then they went to books and they went to newspapers, and there was a physical record of that. So it was really, she was reading Eleanor Sinclair Road and Vita Sackville West and Marion Crans and all the, I could see where her ideas were coming from, and then I could look at how the garden had been developed. Her gardening style was she was a wild, creative woman, and she tried her hand at painting for a while, but in true Sunday style, she decided she didn't like what she'd done, so she destroyed all of her own paintings. But then my interpretation is that she put all that creativity in the garden. So that was a garden that was created with just enough structure to contain the complete wildness that grew up around it. You've got heritage roses and herbs and vegetables. It wasn't a garden that had, the order that one might expect to see with orderly rows. It was a beautiful living example of, and still is to this day, because we garden in her legacy. Obviously a garden, as the others have mentioned, is always a living and breathing and changing place. But that wildness is still apparent there. And that's, I really, one of the things that's so beautiful and really captures the heart about that garden is that you can see her authenticity and her dedication to the garden still comes through today. And people who visit, I can see when people come into the garden, they quieten down. It's quite, it's quite pronounced. You see people's behaviour change. They quieten down. They become gently curious. The energy goes outward a little bit. I would be in the gardens and always have a bit of a fight between getting all the things that I needed done to keep managing the garden done. And also people were so curious, they would constantly be asking me questions. Oh, what plant's that? How did this come about? But that, I thought, I always prioritise those conversations because they're so important, because it gives people the opportunity to see what's going on in a garden like that and then take a little snippet of it in some small way and bring it back into their own gardens. And I think, to me, that's one of the most important contributions that gardens like these make, is the contribution of the inspiration, that they provide to people, but then the spark of inspiration, but then, as I'm sure the others will talk about, then the expertise to bring that into life in your own garden in some way.
Yeah, creating connection.
Yeah, and more gardens in the world.
There was something you touched on there about how your demeanour changes when you enter the garden, and I think that, Justin, can you talk about that in terms of the community experience of Ripponlea and why you think it sort of has come to be this urban oasis for so many people?
Yeah, it's a really, because I guess, a bit of a hybrid model. So yeah, historically was a private garden. It's obviously been open to the public through the National Trust for the last 50 or so years. But because of our ownership structure, for example, in COVID, we had this, we didn't fall within the public parks regulations, and so there was a long period where we were closed to the public, and the gardeners had this kind of surreal experience of being able to work and maintain the garden and make it look great, but not have anyone there to appreciate that, and for them to feed off that what you've described, the reaction you get from the people. So thankfully those days are over. But also another major change here is in the last 5 or 6 years we've got a great relationship with the City of Glen Eira, who support Ripponlea so that we can provide free garden access to residents here. City of Glen Eira has the lowest amount of public open space in the state. Desperately needs more. As the city densifies, of course, everywhere's going to need more, but it's especially difficult in a part of town like Glen Eira to liberate more space, to find more space. And so for gardens like this to step up, I guess, and become that public asset, and I think that's another really important thing that going forward that hopefully we're breaking down all these sort of distinctions between, well, that's a public garden, that's a private garden, that's a native garden, that's an exotic garden. It's all really should be thought of as one big garden, and it's all an asset for us, and it's all going to play really significant roles into the future just for general daily livability for all of us.
Claire, can you talk a bit more about that livability aspect?
I was just going to add to, like last Sunday being, it was Mother's Day. It's a very busy day in the gardens, but we had 11,000 people through just on that one day. So it is really important that our green spaces are not only activated, but we collaborate and we work together to ensure that that's the well-being and the health of people that are living in urban environments have access to green spaces. As a botanic garden and as private gardens or our large gardens around the more urban area, we have a very unique position to connect people with nature, and that's becoming more and more predominant. So it's balancing that. We have close to 2 million visitors a year. So again, the bigger question is how do we kind of ensure that the landscape isn't being overused as well? So how do we balance that out, and how do we ensure that people can still access these green spaces and that they remain green? And I'll probably just digress a little bit, but it kind of takes me on to the story of adaptation and what we're doing in that climate change space. And from a heritage perspective, that can be really hard because you are balancing those design outcomes with what you expect the garden to be. And the way that I always focus on Melbourne gardens is it needs to be at such a high level of landscape expectation for that person who visits once a year to someone who might come 2 or 3 times a year to that person who visits every day. They expect it to look and be the same. So a couple of, in a way that we do work through climate adaptation, we have a very strong landscape succession strategy. So to put that in a nutshell, it's how we're transitioning the plantscape now to be climate resilient and to be able to exist in a hotter, drier climate from Melbourne of 2090, which we know could be up to 3 degrees warmer. So in doing that, we have opportunities that come through, sometimes through sad circumstances. And I'll give an example of, we had a white oak on our oak lawn. Now in 2019, it lost a major limb, and we kind of got a little bit worried and thought, well, what's going to happen here, and is this tree going to be able to be retained? Within 2 days, 3 other limbs came down, so we put a big fence around it. And it comes back to that strong heritage and storytelling. There was a real outpouring of grief when people saw the fence and realised that that tree was no longer there. It was a really strong meeting place for a lot of people, and a lot of people had strong connection to that. So instead of what could happen in the past, like where we would perhaps remove the tree and go plant another one in there and that story be gone, we left the tree in situ, and it's still there now. we've got the main stem, and we left the branching structure to create seats. And then we planted more of an indigenous palette around it. And as an opportunity for climate adaptation or landscape succession, we planted 3 new oaks. So we're still keeping in that heritage frame of oaks and oak lawn, because that's one of our major collections. But now we have 3 oaks that are going to be climate suited for that 2090, 3 degrees warmer. So we're ensuring that the integrity of oak lawn remains, that our generation next is going to be able to sit under those oaks, enjoy that seasonal change, enjoy obviously the shade and the coolness that lawn gives us. But it's the integrity of honouring that heritage landscape that we're able to think now, not just in 5 years, even 10 years, but we think in decades when we're planning and looking at how we need to adapt for a warmer, drier climate. Sorry, that's a big one.
No, it was fascinating. I have a question about the oaks that you replaced, because you didn't plant more white oaks.
No.
So what?
So again,
how does that decision pathway run?
well, it comes back to the horticulturist, in this case the arborist, the person who curates and manages that collection. So again, it was what do we think is going to be suitable for that space, and do we have any plants that can go in? Sometimes it's opportunistic. He'd happened to have been at an oak conference the year before and had a number of acorns. And the thing about oaks or acorns is that they're exceptional species, so they don't store in seed banks. So you've all heard of the Millennium Seed Bank or seed banks related to other herbaria or botanic gardens. Oaks are one of those, or acorns. They need to be planted fairly immediately. They just don't store. So he'd been able to bring back a couple from California, and that was the Quercus lobata. We've also got a Quercus rhizophila and then a Quercus nigra. So they don't come from that more cooler, temperate climate. They're oaks that are going to be suited to up to 3 degrees warmer. So we managed to get them in, so it's a lot of quarantine, it's a lot of phytosanitary, a lot of paperwork. But that's the kind of extent that trained and professional and skilled arborists and horticulturists go to ensure that we've got our green landscapes for the next generation.
It's interesting you mentioned paperwork, because your mind sort of goes to the idea of an overhead bin, just sort of with a carry-on bag crammed full of acorns coming. It's probably not how it works.
No.
What's that sparking for you, Andrea, in terms of sort of climate resilience in gardens?
Where do I start? And I mean, obviously, something like white oak, and how do you actually continue to grow and transition these landscapes? I've worked in a lot of heritage landscapes, most heritage landscapes that would spring to mind in Melbourne, and in over 20 botanic gardens. I've lost track somehow across Australia. But today I was going to talk about some work my team's been doing with Ballarat Botanical Gardens. So Ballarat was one of the first botanical gardens in Australia. You had Melbourne, 1846, you had Geelong, which I think was a couple of years later, and then the next two were Bendigo and Ballarat. And it was also, you mentioned the stories, Anna. This place is deep in stories. So my team designed the landscaping for the new fernery there. We have just completed the master plan. It's at final draft stage, so it hasn't been adopted yet. But in between that, we had the privilege of doing a conservation management plan, which is basically a massive technical heritage document to understand what's special about the place and its values. And this was something like 200,000 words or something. It went hundreds and hundreds of pages. But it allowed us to do this absolute deep dive onto the garden and what makes it special. And there's an image that's floating around on the screens here with some old photos. And one of the things that strikes me with these gardens is, in some ways, they look completely different to what they used to. And in other ways, the challenges are exactly the same. So the old photos that are floating around in Ballarat, if you know those gardens, you would not recognise it, because it started fairly bare, it was hot, it was dry, it was sunny. Now it's heavily shaded. A lot of the diversity disappears, the microclimate changes, the canopy grows. Changing fashions and tastes. There was a massive financial crash in the 1890s, and then there was skill shortages during the Second World War and afterwards, and anyone who's had a beautiful garden and sold the house and watched it from the street will understand how quickly these gardens degrade. I'm seeing recognition in the audience. So this garden's changed a lot, but equally, a lot of the challenges these early gardens face, not Ballarat so much, but Fitzroy and Carlton, issues like how do you keep the lawns mowed? It was a incredible issue in these early gardens. They were running goats, they were running cows, they planted garden beds along path edges to hide this trashy lawn. Ballarat, we think, has the oldest cafe in a botanic garden, in a garden, full stop, in Australia. We haven't found an older one. And it was because it was one of the first tourist attractions in the state. People would day trip up on the train from Geelong and Melbourne, they would catch a paddle steamer across Lake Wendouree, they would have their picnic, they would leave behind all their rubbish, and then they would go home again. And this cafe was trying to address that. And then once we've finished that conservation management plan and we go to the master plan and we start talking to people, we've got these stories. And every time we do a master plan for a garden, we ask people what they value. And the stories that come out, this is a place of solace, this is a place of family gathering, this is a place I remember coming as a small child. I bring my children, I bring my grandchildren. My sister got married here, my daughter got married here. All of these incredible people connections across these landscapes. And because we've done this conservation assessment and we know what's changed and what hasn't and what people value, we know where we can shift and where we can move. So the new master plan's got plans for a children's garden, which everyone asked for. It's got plans for a hands-on learning garden because people love talking to the horticulturists. As Alice said, they just value that so much, being able to go up and have a chat. So a place where they can actually come and learn. Building back a second glass house because the first one's fallen down. So there's all these layers here and this change that actually supports how people love and use these spaces today. And there's some wonderful, the stories I could go on and on.
That's so fascinating, Andrea, and so interesting to see that even now those places are being shaped in response to community need and what people want to see, but also, you know, a second glass house. You know, glass houses are not really a 21st century trend, shall I say?
Well, they've had three for decades, 100 years.
So that's part of people's connection to the history of the place. That's so interesting. Claire, I'm really interested in asking you more, and Justin too, because you're operating at different scales here and at different at different scales. So in terms of climate adaptation, Claire, you said it's about keeping those places green. Can you talk a little bit more about and Justin, the kinds of decisions that you're having to make around your gardens and climate change?
Yeah, well, initially I would say that a lot of our garden, particularly, Melbourne garden being so old, it's already experienced climate change. So we already know that temperature has risen. So there's a lot of our trees that have already been through a process, particularly things like the old Eucalyptus camaldulensis, which are remnant vegetation on site. So it's a really big thing to step into, but it's something that we do, I think, in a positive space. But we also don't do it alone, because climate change isn't a project, nor is it a management decision. It's something that we all need to own. And again, from Melbourne Gardens' perspective, we use that, or have started, the strategy that we use is called a landscape succession strategy. And as I mentioned before, it's how we're transitioning the garden now in order to stay the same for our future and next generations. We can't do that by ourselves, and we collaborate with other botanic gardens with a strong focus on now developing not collections just in our gardens, but more of what we call a meta collection focus. And that means that we're sharing material with each other all the time. And we do that to ensure that it's what we call ex situ collections, so our conservation collections of plants that can't exist in the wild also are duplicated in other botanic gardens. So we're ensuring the longevity of some plant species. So much more broader than that, there's ways that botanic gardens connect in a networking space, and that's called BGAN, so Botanic Gardens Australia and New Zealand, and it's not just botanic gardens as well. Obviously Ripponlea is a big part of that. Justin and I sit on the Victorian committee for BGANs, but more broadly, what's happened is that there's a global botanic gardens network, and that's a Climate Change Alliance for Botanic Gardens, and actually started right here in Melbourne. So again, because of this landscape succession strategy, and it's something that got a lot of press from around the world because no one else was doing it. No one else was looking at that forward-thinking decades of how we're going to manage our gardens in the future. So there was a climate change summit back in 2018. That was about 13 different organisations. They did a deep dive over 3 days, and at the end of that, they decided the time for action was now. So that was the start of the Climate Change Alliance for Botanic Gardens. Started in Melbourne, we're the current secretariat, and that now we're connected to over 500 botanic gardens across the globe. And that's a really strong knowledge-sharing platform. And we connect with each other to work out what's happening in everyone's spaces, what new information is coming out, and how we can adapt. And I'm using adaptation because mitigation doesn't happen fast enough. And anyway, all the work that we do in the adaptation space will, if mitigation catches up, they'll sleeve in beautifully. So it's not about, I guess, sitting back and thinking, oh, we'll just have to wait and see what might happen. It's actually embracing it and looking and facing it front on, that climate change is happening and that we all need to be active in that space. So anyone from my apprentice knows what landscape succession is and knows that when they might be planting a new tree in the garden, they need to ensure that it's had a climate assessment process attached to it. So we've looked at it and we've decided, okay, we know that it's going to cope with the temperatures, a 3-degree warmer temperature, and that we can mitigate other circumstances like irrigation or rain, or precipitation really, via irrigation. So temperature is a big thing for us because we can't control it, but we can control irrigation to a certain degree. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is that botanic gardens across the globe are very much connected in that climate change space. And if we don't do it, nobody else will. So we've got to ensure that we're taking that lead in adaptation in green spaces. And from that as well, from a heritage perspective, we've been contacted by other organisations from across the globe, and Andrea's about to talk at the World Monuments Fund, which again, a very huge heritage focused organisation that has again asked us for support on how they're going to transition some of their landscapes associated with strong cultural spaces across the globe. So Botanic Gardens are really being very active in this space and just taking a lead. And it's quite a positive space to step into if you allow yourself to just get over the fear of it. So there's other things that I could say, but I might just leave it at that. So Andrea can...
And just as a lovely example to link it back to the heritage side as well, my team's helping with some work with Botanic Gardens of Sydney in this space and how they're dealing with the impacts of climate change. And when you look at the heritage registration with Heritage New South Wales for the Royal Botanic Gardens Sydney, the one right next to the Opera House there, one of the key things that has led to that place's registration is the fact that it has the impact it has had on the greater Sydney area with the plants it has trialled and the research it has done and the experimentation, and how that has led to the greater city of Sydney's streetscapes looking the way they are. So this work that the Botanic Gardens have the resources and the passion to lead the way on then filters out into other gardens and streetscapes and even into people's home gardens.
And I think it's worth stressing from the heritage perspective that adaptation and innovation, or that approach to the gardens, is not new at all to these heritage gardens. That's how the people that were managing them were dealing with them from day one. I mean, there were plants brand new to cultivation coming off ships every other day. No one had grown them. No one had grown them in your part of the world, and people really had no idea how they'd perform, and so it was trial and error. There wasn't a tap every 10 metres throughout the gardens to keep plants alive. It was hard work, and plants that were adaptable and resilient were in high demand, and finding out which ones of those you had and which ones you hadn't was just part and parcel of developing gardens like this. So we shouldn't be afraid of that change that we're undertaking in succession planning for our heritage gardens, because it's just a continuation of how they've always been managed.
And there's a specific criteria for creative and technical achievement, which all of this work is actually enhancing the heritage value of the place. Sorry, Al.
That's okay. I mean, all gardens are a response to environment at any given time, aren't they? So it's just that constant adaptation. And I mean, that's the beauty of gardening, like in both a personal and a professional sense. But in listening to you all talk, it's so obvious to me, and we've touched on it a little bit, but these places are centres of expertise. and centres of excellence and centres of knowledge, and they're very connected, as you were saying. And this, it came into my mind as you were speaking. It's like, you're the influencers. You know, if you're going to follow any influencer, like follow the gardens, follow the gardening experts. And I personally have used some of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens resources in just plant selection and informing, or even in my personal practice in my home garden, what am I going to plant? What am I going to choose? So, you know, it filters out into the world from these gardens.
Do any of you have tips about how people can draw on these centres of knowledge in their own gardening endeavours? Do you want to talk about some of the toolkits that RBG put together?
Just on the website, if you go to the RBGV website and look under initiatives, there is a whole heap of information on the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens, and it addresses and gives you free tools. I must stress that the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens is free. It has to have a strong altruistic focus because, climate change isn't about dollars either. So there's a couple of really key tools on there. One is called the Landscape Succession Toolkit. I keep talking about the one for Melbourne Gardens. We've developed one that any botanic garden, any home gardener, any landscape manager can use and adapt to their own site-specific areas. And there's another fantastic tool that will take me too long to talk about, but I'll just give you the reference. It's called the CAT. It's a climate assessment tool. And if you want to find your way to it, it's cat.bgci.org. And that is a super simple tool that anyone can use. It has a massive tree data set behind it. You literally put in the tree that you might want to grow. You look at the current climate scenario, it will give you a 2050 climate scenario and then a 2090 climate scenario for whether that tree is going to be suitable for a warmer, drier climate. They're free tools available to anyone and everyone who from a home gardener right up to any botanic garden across the globe. So, have a look and see and just play around. And I think that's the simplest thing. It's just to, if you're talking about tips, for me, it's just doing tiny tasks. So looking up a new website, looking up a new plant, looking to see whether it is going to be suited for your garden for another 50 years. So without getting overwhelmed, they're simple things that you can undertake and do today if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I had a friend who wants to put a new tree into his front yard, and he came and asked me, and I'm going to look super knowledgeable next time he asks me. Sorry, did I cut you off, Justin? Andrew?
Oh no, I was just going to say, and you can't be just being observant as you walk around. I still get amazed as I walk the streets or different places and see a plant doing well in a particular area I didn't think it would. And don't be afraid to say hi to gardeners when you're here and ask them question. As we've discussed, they love the interaction with the public and
pretty friendly.
Yeah, that's right. They're good people by nature.
And I was going to say what Justin said about being observant. Plus, if you happen to be at a botanic garden, there's lots of plant labels. So if you don't know what something is, there's a cheap way of finding out.
So I want to ask you for just a final thought, something that you want to leave people with today. If we don't, what's something that we should take away in your perspective? So I might start with you, Alice.
For me, I suppose gardens are all about connection, and how they make you feel. And then, the thing that influences the way people act the most is, what's in their heart and how they feel, how being somewhere makes them feel. And so I suppose if you see something beautiful that really moves you, kind of engage with that and see if you can bring a part of that into your own life and your own garden.
Thanks. Justin?
There's so much I could talk about, but I suppose there's one thing I would say is that we need to value these places, but more importantly, we need to let the powers that be know how much we value them, because there's going to be greater and greater pressures. For example, yes, we need more housing. I've got children, I want them to have a home, but that is going to put huge pressures on the green space that we have, the trees that we have across our urban areas, and it won't be good enough to, as an afterthought in 10 or 20 years, think, now let's tackle that issue. We need to sort them both out at the same time and make sure we continue to have the livable green spaces that we do today.
Claire?
I might just say the word collaborate and just mention that, as horticulturists and as gardeners, our knowledge is only best shared. There is no use or no function in just holding on to it. Collaborate, talk, and continue to develop strong communication just with your neighbour, your local botanic garden, your local garden, private garden, even your local park. And just to mention that there's over 40 botanic gardens in Victoria, and here's a task for you all. Go and visit at least one or two of them over the next, 6 months maybe. See how that gets you.
Great. Andrea?
And probably mine is just that heritage doesn't necessarily mean old, it does mean special, and that is about that connection of people to places, and that there are extraordinarily talented, passionate people that are caring for these special places.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear a question from the audience. Does anyone have something that they'd like to ask our 4 brilliant plant people? Please. Absolutely.
I think it's a good question, and probably what I needed to say is we're not kind of suggesting that everything needs to be dry and arid. One of our collections that has the highest climate risk is the Aotearoa, the New Zealand collection. Why we keep that and why it's important is that, as one of the previous kind of horticultural curators said, it's like a time machine for our New Zealand colleagues. So our temperature's already warmer, so we can tell them what plants are doing really well. Because the important thing is that plants are going to surprise us as they do. Look, I'm not sure about hydrangeas. However, you might be able to keep that small microclimate that really, for the plants that you really love, and just transition some of the plants around it.
You're probably looking after 1 or more hydrangeas, Justin?
Yeah, well, I guess I was going to say, just briefly mention, so Ripponlea has an amazing visionary irrigation and drainage system that was put in 150 years ago. It's even today you would call it a best practice integrated water management project, and you would not have a hope of retrofitting it into this site now if you tried to do it.
It's drawing water from as far away as Caulfield Racecourse, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So the area around here, you may or may not know that there was a lot of water that was a problem. There were swamps. It was all drained. It still runs under the roads, under houses today, on its way to the bay. A problem that was basically made to go away. The lake at Ripponlea is that water being harvested and stored for irrigation here. And so, as I said, you couldn't possibly build that into the site now if you wanted to. But what it means is that we have more water security at Ripponlea than we do at our other National Trust gardens around the state. And so Ripponlea can be a bit of a refuge in a way that other gardens wouldn't be. So like Claire's talking about, rather, it's not about one size or one rule across all gardens, and some gardens will have a special role to play where that suits them, to be a refuge for things that we aren't able to grow in your average park or garden anymore. Yeah, well, it's a huge amount of maintenance, huge amount of work. Yeah, so there's nothing easy or cheap about it, and we recently relined all the drainage pipes a few years ago. So yeah, the system's being constantly upgraded and modernised. It's all automated, etc. But it's a huge amount of work. Ask any of the gardeners who are here, and in summer you spend almost. It feels like you're spending all your time just keeping the system running. Yes. Yeah, it would be all up, and wiring and the rest of it.
Seen some memorable photos of Ripponlea gardeners just sort of covered in pipe contents from having cleaned out the drainage. It's not always glamorous work, is it?
No, it's not. It's and it's unique to the job here. But as I said, it's also provided us with a unique opportunity to hold on to some plants that we're probably going to have to let go in our other gardens sooner rather than later.
Christina, thanks.
I'm knee deep in that at the moment, so I'm happy to start. So I am actually I spent Friday doing this for a garden. What we start by doing is working out which of the trees actually have the most heritage value in the garden, because not all the trees have the same value. You also understand what the character of the garden is, and quite often that's what we're trying to replicate, is the actual character of the place. So Melbourne Gardens, for example, is that beautiful dark green subtropical, but actually a very high percentage of the trees are Australian native, but they're rainforest trees. So we have a look at what those values are. We'll, for a garden that may have less scientific work than Melbourne, we would actually put those through some sort of climate assessment. We would work out whether or not we think that tree's a suitable tree for replanting in that space. If it is a suitable tree, we'll probably recommend that we continue to do that, particularly where it is something that is somewhat unusual. If it's something that there's lots and lots of, we may recommend some changes, because we're trying to get as much diversity in as well, because that's part of resilience. So if a landscape's 50% Quercus robur, which is the English oak, that's not a very resilient landscape, and we might be trying to get some more depth in the oaks, for example. But if it's unusual, if it's suitable, we would be persisting with it. And if it's not suitable, we're trying to match the values. So if the values are about it being a beautiful tree, with magnificent autumn colour, that's what we would be looking for. If it's a tall, thin, focal tree in the landscape, that's what we'd be looking for. And a really good example is Ballarat, where they've got an avenue of Sequoiadendron giganteum, the American redwood. That avenue was planted 10 years after it became known to science in the Americas. It was like planting an avenue of Wollemi pines in about 2000. It would have been an extraordinary undertaking. But those trees, we have evidence have been dying since the 1940s. There's an aerial photograph of the 1930s with gaps in that avenue. They poured all they could at those trees to preserve them in the millennium drought. It didn't work, and they are slowly dying from the north side backwards, vascular collapse due to heat. Basically, it's like a giant pump, and Justin would know about pumps and heads and everything here. The taller the tree, the more it has trouble pumping its water to the top. But there's another tree, the coast redwood, which comes from a drier part of America. If you're not a plant nut like we all are, you'd effectively think they were the same thing. The leaves are different, but the stature, the size, the trunk, everything looks similar. So we've got a tree that has the same look, the same feel, the same effect in that landscape, and is more climate resilient. So that's a really easy swap. If we don't have a direct swap, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's the basic approach to how we do it.
Yeah, I guess that word diversity again. Simply, the less diversity you've got in your landscape, the less climate resilience you're building into your landscape. So I guess that there's, as well as sort of case by case, individual species discussions, that should also be in the context of a wider landscape discussion as to how resilient is this landscape, or how do we build more resilience into it. I mean, we haven't talked about pests and diseases. That's the one thing that keeps me awake at night, because there's so much we don't know about what is going to happen to pest and disease patterns as the climate changes, and that can have really severe consequences really quickly. But they're generally they're restricted to certain families or certain species. So again, that's where the diversity comes in. If you're not reliant just on a handful of plants, then you're more able to withstand a calamity such as that.
Just add that then that's just another role that horticulturists play is in our biosecurity and knowing what pest and disease are coming up, knowing what to look for. So it is that strong skill set that we still need to develop because we're constantly doing that. I can mention Polyphagus shothole borer, which some of you may have read. It was in Good Weekend and a couple of weekends ago, and it's devastated a lot of the trees in Perth and Kings Park, if you know Kings Park, and some of the large figs. It's not, we're just waiting for it to come here. So again, a whole heap of background work that we won't go into now, but we're already monitoring, already connected to the City of Melbourne, already been over to Perth and spoken with our colleagues there, already have a whole lot of monitoring in place and working out what we need to do because we know it's going to arrive. So yeah, pest and disease, soils, water management, increase in weather events. I know I'm getting towards some of the more catastrophic stuff, but that's something that we do all the time. We're always monitoring and forecasting for what's going to come next.
Looking ahead to manage our places of the past. Thank you very much to each of you for sharing your passion with us today, and thank you to our audience for being part of our conversation. These gardens really belong to all of us, and their future is being shaped not only by the people who look after them, but also the public who visit and appreciate and love them and have connections to them, as we've heard today, generation after generation. So please make a plan to visit these spaces, the RBG, Heidi, Ballarat, or Ripponlea, where you are today, or another National Trust garden. If you're curious about what you can do in your own garden, there's so much on offer. Claire talked about some resources on the Royal Botanic Gardens website. Alice has a brand new book called A Heidi Harvest. Andrea, you didn't mention, but Botanic Gardens Week starts this week, and you were going to mention that. If you've been an admirer of the National Trust and their work, please support Justin and his team of gardeners with a donation. You can do so in the lead up to the end of the financial year to support the National Trust's appeal, or you can take out National Trust membership, which for mine is amazing value because I get to enjoy all these places with my little one. I'd like to again acknowledge the Heritage Council of Victoria for sponsoring this event, and thank you to the National Trust for hosting us for Botanica at the beautiful Ripponlea today. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.